And thanks for inviting me back. I don't know how many of you have anything to do with that, but thank you anyway. I'm sure you'd have something to do if I wasn't invited back, wouldn't you? Like, don't get her again. Anyway, thank you very much. It's really lovely to be with you, and what a beautiful day. What an incredible weekend for a bank holiday weekend, to have that glowing orb in the sky of the sun. So thank you for having me. It's really lovely to be back with you. And I'm going to do something that I don't think I've done before when I've been speaking. So when I was planning what I was going to talk about, I was praying about different things, and I kept coming back to a particular phrase. And then I went back through my files and realised that I've spoken on this passage here before. And it was February of 2019. But I sort of think like anything that happened before COVID is a different world away. Also, I couldn't remember what I'd spoken on, so I thought it's reasonably certain that nobody else will remember the passage. But if you do, then this is different. It is a different talk to what I talked about last time. But I showed this picture, so if that jogs your memory, maybe you have got a much better memory than I have. But if you haven't, let's all just style it out together, pretend I didn't say any of that, and we'll just keep moving on. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about hope. And I think one of the clearest messages of hope that I've ever read is that 11% of UK teenagers think that fruit pastels are one of your 5 a day. And if that is not a sign of hope, then I don't know what is. But I've always found hope, or the idea of hope, a bit difficult. And I don't know if you could put the next slide up, please. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this 1980s film with John Cleese. It's called Clockwise. And in this film, he plays the head of a school who is always on time, obsessively so. And everything in his life, all the different aspects of his life, run like clockwork, which is the opposite of me. But he ends up in this film, he's supposed to be chairing a head teachers' conference in Norwich, and a series of calamitous and hilarious events happened, and he misses his train and he loses his speech, and he makes a sixth form student called Laura drive him to the conference, and for reasons I honestly can't remember, he ends up in a monastery, and he's there wearing monk's clothes. The car gets stolen, and John Cleese and Laura chase after this disappearing car, and he throws himself on the floor in desperation, and he says this. He says, "It's not the despair, Laura. I can cope with the despair. It's the hope." And I sort of feel like I can empathise with that. I sometimes protect myself against hope because it's easier and safer. And so I can cope with the despair, but sometimes the hope is harder for us to deal with. And if you follow any sport, then I think you'll understand that quite well. Now, given Ipswich's performance yesterday, I could have had a story closer to home, but I wanted to make sure that I was preparing a positive story. So if we can have the next couple of slides. There we go. So this is a story of hope fulfilled. And this is the owners of Wrexham FC, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. And I don't know if anyone's watched the TV series Welcome to Wrexham, and it follows the ups and downs of this former National League club. Even if you're not into football, it's really quite a good watch. And so these two stars bought the club in February 2021 for £2 million. And they were going after, they were hopeful. The whole town was hoping for them to get promoted into League Two. And the whole series is this story of heartache and joy. And last week it happened, but it wasn't easy for them either. They went 1-0 down in the opening minute of this game that if they won it was going to see them getting promoted with a game in hand. And they won. They had a 3-1 win. And they've been waiting 15 years for this promotion. And the scenes of joy and hope fulfilled that took place in that town and were all over the news have been absolutely phenomenal. There they were, this hope fulfilled. So the passage that we're going to look at, again, is from the end of Luke. And it's really kind of part of the Easter story. And it might be a story that you hear at Easter, but we're close enough, aren't we? Let's have a look. So we're going to look at Luke chapter 24, from verse 13. So that very day, so this is the day that Jesus had come back to life. That very day, two of them, that's two disciples, not the 12, not of the 11 apostles, but the bigger group of disciples. That very day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, which lay about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were discussing with each other all the various things that had taken place. As they were discussing and arguing with each other, Jesus himself approached and walked with them. Their eyes, though, were prevented from recognizing him. "You're obviously having a very important discussion on your walk," he said. "What's it all about?" They stood still, a picture of gloom. Then one of them, Cleopas by name, answered him. "You must be the only person around Jerusalem," he said, "who doesn't know what's been going on there these last few days." "What things?" he asked. "To do with Jesus of Nazareth," they said to him. "He was a prophet. He acted with power and he spoke with power before God and all the people. Our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. But we were hoping that he was going to redeem Israel. And now, what with all this, it's the 3rd day since it happened. But some women from our group have astonished us. They went to his tomb very early this morning and didn't find his body. They came back saying they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of the folk with us went off to see the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see him." "You are so senseless," he said to them, "so slow in your hearts to believe all the things the prophets said to you. Don't you see? This is what had to happen. The Messiah had to suffer and then come into his glory." So he began with Moses and with all the prophets and explained to them the things about himself throughout the whole Bible. They drew near to the village where they were heading. Jesus gave the impression that he was going further, but they urged him strongly not to. "Stay with us," they said. "It's nearly evening. The day is almost gone." And he went in to stay with them. As he was sitting at the table with them, he took the bread and gave thanks. He broke it and gave it to them. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Thanks. If we have the next slide, please. Thank you. So we don't fully know who these two people are. We know one is called Cleopas. We often see these images of it being two men. It's actually most probably a married couple. It's probably a man and a woman. That's why she doesn't have a name. But most people who illustrate this passage rather randomly always go with two men. But they're heading away from Jerusalem. They're heading away from the whole Eastern narrative. All of that story had happened. And they're arguing. And they're joined on this walk by this figure. And this was supposed to be their day. They must have given up a lot to follow Jesus. They'd seen the momentum gather. They could see things were moving really quickly by the end. And they were expecting this triumphant end to the story. When the Romans were defeated, when everyone could finally see that Jesus really was the Messiah, the chosen one, the special one. And when they're approached by this stranger, they tell him all about it. They tell Jesus all about Jesus. It's quite a weird situation, isn't it? And they talk about all the hopes that they'd had. We had hoped. Jesus' life took place against a backdrop of years of tension, years of warfare against the Jews, and infighting amongst the Jews as well. About 60 years before Jesus was born, there was a Roman emperor called Pompey, and he laid siege to Jerusalem for 3 months. And then he killed about 12,000 Jews when he came out of that siege, including some of the leaders of Jerusalem. That was just 60 years before Jesus was born. And the Romans in that area were really organised. They wanted to make sure that a rebellion like that didn't happen again in that area. So 20 years after the siege, about 40 years before Jesus was born, Jerusalem was again attacked. And Herod, who you might have heard of from A Christmas Story, he was in charge before the attack. And he went to Rome, and Rome said, you are king of the Jews. You're going to go back to Jerusalem and you're going to lead that area. And there've been decades, generations of really hard times for the Jews. But through it all, there'd been just this whisper of hope, this thread of hope, this growing feeling of hope that there would come a Messiah, there would come an anointed king who would start a whole new movement that would release the Jews from all the oppressive rulers that were coming in, that were taxing them really heavily. They would bring in, this new ruler would bring in a period of peace and a period of justice. And that was what they were hoping for. Nobody really knew how that king, that anointed one, was going to appear. Some people thought it would be like the Marvel film version, and there would be a warrior that would rise up, like all the ancient hero stories, like we have those, King Arthur and all of those legends that people have. Some people thought it was going to come like that. Some people thought this anointed king was going to come and make the temple right and start new ways with a true worship of God. All the Jews thought that this new king would fulfill the prophecies that had been written in the Old Testament. They didn't necessarily think this person was going to be God. They didn't know how it was going to work out in practice. There was just this thread, this whisper of hope, whatever they'd been going through. And other people had come in and claimed to be the Messiah, and it had turned out to be wrong. And then there was Jesus. And these two people walking on this road had hoped that this was going to be the fulfillment of that hope. This was the one that everybody was waiting for, that political and military hero who would finally bring freedom from the Romans, freedom from all the taxes, freedom from injustice, and bring peace. All of this hope was there. And then Jesus dies. And the disciples were expecting Jesus to do something incredible. They were expecting this hero to bring freedom. And Jesus dies. It's so confusing. But we look at them with the benefit of the rest of the Bible, the rest of the New Testament, and we think, well, how can they have been so narrow-minded? How could they have missed who Jesus was? But I think people in the New Testament might actually look at us and think, how can you be so narrow-minded? The people of the New Testament times believed in a God who was full of power. They believed in a God who could wipe out their enemies with a single stroke, who could bring down the walls of Jericho with a park run and some trumpets. Their God was full of power and they were full of hope. And Jesus came and he fulfilled all of those Old Testament prophecies. The way he was talking, the things that he was doing, and people were thinking, this is it. This is the time. All those years of expectation and waiting, and then he was killed. It's no wonder that this couple are dejected and defeated, walking away from where they'd last seen Jesus, walking away from where, rumour had it, the risen Jesus had actually been seen, walking away from the place where their hope had run hot and their expectations had been there. And as they're walking away, Jesus meets them. And he meets them even though they're going the wrong way. In the midst of their disappointment, Jesus meets them. And it wasn't just a disappointment, as we've said, it wasn't just a disappointment of a couple of days. I sometimes read this passage and think, oh, well, obviously, they've had Good Friday and it's Easter Sunday and they're disappointed from the last 2 days. It's not that. It's the disappointment of generations, of years that have been weighing them down, that they were thinking, finally, we're there. Finally, we've got it. The hopes and expectations of generations, and this is the answer, and then it's not. Now, walking along that road, thinking, well, he wasn't what we were waiting for. The one that they thought were the Messiah was dead. N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, he says in that book how these devout Jews would probably have gone on hoping and waiting for that Messiah. They would have been disappointed before and they were disappointed again, but they were devout, and so they would think, well, it wasn't it this time. And eventually they would have got back to hoping and waiting. They had hoped, but Jesus is dead, so he can't have been the one that we're looking for. The cross, Tom Wright writes in that book, the cross already had a symbolic meaning throughout the Roman world. It meant, we Romans run this place. If you get in our way, we'll obliterate you. Crucifixion meant that the kingdom hadn't come, not that it had, Tom Wright writes. Crucifixion of a would-be Messiah meant that he wasn't the Messiah, not that he was. When Jesus was crucified, every single disciple knew what it meant. We backed the wrong horse. The game is over. Whatever their expectations, as far as they were concerned, hope had crumbled into ashes. That's what he writes in Surprised by Hope. That whole book is about hope. And now you can see this crucified Jesus. They'd backed the wrong horse. As far as they were concerned, whatever their expectations, hope had crumbled into the ashes. And you can see why they have that phrase, we had hoped. You can see the seriousness of the situation that they're in if Jesus stays dead. Because the difference is the power that resurrection brings. The difference that a living Jesus makes to that whole scenario is just an about turn, which is exactly what they do. It's exactly what they do. They're walking away from Jerusalem, from where their hope was, and that meeting with Jesus in the midst of their disappointment, the living Jesus makes that difference to their life, because there is hope and there is life. And no more we had hoped, but we have hope. I don't know where there's been expectation in your life, or where there might be the weight of years, perhaps of generations, of people believing, or of you believing that things are going to be a certain way for you. Maybe it is or was in work. Maybe there was a career path that was sort of laid out for you, or an area that you were supposed to work in. Or maybe it's that you weren't going to have a paid job at all. Maybe that was an expectation that was put on you. Perhaps there's an expectation that you have put on yourself or that others have put on you about having a family that looks a certain way or that is raised a particular way. It could be church. It could be this community. And maybe you're feeling the pressure from other people and what they expect of you, or from what you've expected of your own life. And maybe you've come to church this morning full of, I had hoped. We had hoped. Maybe like those two people on that road, what you need to see is the risen Jesus. We've just taken to communion and we've remembered the risen Jesus. Maybe you need a new experience of him, just as Cleopas and his companion had. And that really might not be comfortable. Jesus doesn't hold back on his words with them. Why are you so senseless, he says. It's not a comfortable place to be in when Jesus says something like that to you. But come to God anyway and ask him to show you. Pray, read the Bible, get close to God again. See the risen Jesus, to move from we had hoped to we have hope. And there's one more mysterious thing that happens in this passage before Jesus reveals who he is. And Luke writes that Jesus pretends that he's going to go on further. He makes out that he's going to carry on, that he's not going to stop for food. And it just adds another really weird aspect to this story. And sometimes that's not the Jesus that I want. If I had been in their position with all of this weight of generational expectation that here is the Messiah, I don't want a Jesus that comes and says, first of all, look, Sarah Jane, you're being really stupid. And secondly, I'm going to pretend to be doing something that I'm not. Sometimes I think I've got Jesus totally figured out. And then I read this passage and I think, I haven't got it at all. I don't know what's going on. And I also read that passage and think, do you know what? I don't think that's the Jesus that I would need at that point in time. I would want a Jesus that's going to come alongside me and comfort me and tell me straight away, it's me, I've risen, I'm alive. And he tells the disciples that they're slow, that they're senseless. He pretends to go in and have dinner with them. And if we want to be more like Jesus, does that mean that we need to bring a bit more of an air of mystery? I don't think we tell people they're stupid. But their hope is gone. And who is this Jesus that's coming there? And I find Jesus, as I said, sometimes utterly confusing. I think I know him. I think I understand what he's going to do. And then he does something just out of the blue which feels so strange. I think there's a lot more in that passage. And if you want to dig into it deeper, I'd really encourage you to do that. Sometimes Jesus is challenging. Sometimes Jesus is the most simple and the most complicated person all bound up into one. I thought this wasn't the Jesus that I would have wanted if I was one of the disciples, but maybe it is. Maybe it is after all. He lets them tell him all about who he is. They say out loud all of the things that they know about him, kind of reaffirming to themselves that they do know it. They have got it. They just needed to think a little bit further about what their hopes were. There could be all sorts of reasons why Jesus pretends that he's going to go on further. Maybe he's teaching them something about waiting, about trusting, about getting to know him as trustworthy. But in the end, it was what Jesus did that they recognise him. That simple act of having a meal together and him taking the bread and breaking it, giving thanks, breaking it and giving it to them. It's in that act that they recognise who he is. And when I was preparing, I was listening to a podcast by the American Beth Moore. It wasn't on this passage, but she said these words: could it be that the God of mystery, who revels in revelation, sometimes intentionally holds back? Could it be that he is as intentional about what he holds back compared to what he reveals? Perhaps he is intentional about what you do not know as much as about what you do know. She said that's the thrill of getting to know God. That's the thrill of God being sovereign over what we can't figure out, that we have to trust him. We have to trust him with the process. And that felt so relevant for this passage. This God of mystery who revels in revelation. Here is the person of Jesus, God in a body, acting as if he doesn't know what's happened, pretending he's not going to stay with them, being intentional about what he's holding back, and when he reveals it. And when he reveals it, that moment is perfect. In the midst of their disappointment, Jesus comes and he walks with them. He isn't who they think he's going to be, but maybe that's because he's something better. In our waiting and in our times of disappointment when we had hoped, maybe the Jesus that is revealed to us is not who we think he's going to be, but maybe he's something better. We expect a Jesus who's going to come as one thing, and he comes as something else. Whatever your disappointments are, whatever you had hoped for, the risen Jesus comes alongside you, not always with the answers that you expect, not always in the way that you expect, but he comes with power. Where do you need to change your idea of who Jesus is? Where have you been disappointed with him? Is there somewhere that you've been waiting for Jesus to show up, and you've been waiting for him to show up in one way, and maybe he's already there, but not in the way that you imagined? I really love this little book. It's by an author called Jason Boyett. It's called O Me of Little Faith, True Confessions of a Spiritual Weakling. And he talks a lot about doubt and faith and all of that journey. And he writes this passage, and we've got the next picture. It's about ice cream vans. Stay with me. He says this: on a summer day, you can hear the neighbourhood ice cream truck for a long time before it finally arrives. It plays Pop Goes the Weasel on an endless loop. Endless. I can't imagine how ice cream truck drivers deal with it on a daily basis. When the first notes of the song begin, blocks away, you know the truck is in the neighbourhood. But you can't see it. And you're never sure when you should stop your game of soccer in the yard and run to the curb. So you wait and wait. Finally, the truck turns the corner and that faint melody becomes so loud you can't hear anything else. Faith is like that. It's believing that God will arrive even if you can barely hear his song right now. Faith is believing that God will arrive even if you can barely hear his song right now. Has disappointment meant that you can barely hear God's song right now? Have you been hoping for a God to show up in a particular way and he hasn't done that? Maybe he's closer than you think. Maybe it's time to stop that game, put your ball down and wait for that ice cream truck to come. Maybe he has been walking with you, but maybe you just haven't recognised that it's him. But may the God of mystery, who revels in revelation, show himself again to you today, this week, this year.